which we talked about. So what are some of these molecular factors that regulate the development of the digestive system? So we're just going to run through them so that you are aware that it's really regulated. We have retinoic acid specifying the regions of the gut in terms of the development of the epithelia, the development of epithelia specifically. Then we have the Hox genes. Remember, Hox genes are usually very important in segmentation. So this defines a cradiocaudal polarity and specifies which structure will develop from which part of the primitive tube. So when I talk about cradiocaudal pattern, I'm saying, okay, the upper part will develop from the esophagus, there's a part developing stomach, and all that. All those are defined by the Hox genes. Now, the retinoic acid induced expression of transcription factors in the mesoderm. Those mesodermal factors also will have some influence on the actual development of the epithelium. So these are some of the areas of the Hox genes that are induced. The stomach, the esophagus, that is homeobox number 2, the duodenum, the small intestines. The mesoderm is induced by retinoic acid so that we have these parts with its structures. Similarly, form the glands of the stomach and the connective tissue. Recap that when you are dealing with the respiratory system, we talked about at the floor of the foregut, where you have development of the respiratory system from the endoderm, we normally have a septum, tracheoesophageal septum. This divides that bud, the bud from the floor, which is going to form the lungs, and the trachea into a dorsal part that forms the esophagus and a ventral part that now forms the trachea, the larynx and the trachea. So during this development,
Mimi niko nje ama nimesisikii?
Sorry for the interruption. I hope you are getting me now. Class rep, are you getting me? Class rep, are you getting me?
I'm getting you.
Okay, fine. I'll just continue. I was talking about the hindgut as an area where you have a cloaca, which is an opening for both the digestive system, the urinary system, and also the reproductive system. So in the development of the cloaca, we have the urorectal septum, which grows towards our cloacal membrane. It's a V-shaped type of growth towards the cloacal membrane. Once it connects to the cloacal two parts, the dorsal part becomes the rectum, the ventral part becomes the primary urogenital sinus. Sometimes the urorectal septum might not completely extend up to the cloacal membrane, or it will fuse distally but have a hole. So when you have a hole within the membrane, during the development of the other organs of the urogenital sinus, there'll be a connection between the rectum and the urogenital sinus derivatives. That we refer to as a fistula. That we'll see, in which case we'll have a fistula connecting that to those particular structures. Now here we have a complete fusion between urorectal septum and the cloacal membrane. Now the cloacal membrane is divided into two parts. It's divided into the anal part here, and then the urogenital sinus on this side membrane. Occasionally, this part of it breaks down, but it might not undergo the apoptosis, so we will have a patent anus. We'll have a patent or a membrane. So this is what we refer to as an imperforate anus. Now, the primary urogenital sinus then divides into several parts. We have the dorsal part forming the urinary bladder. The ventral part will be divided now the pelvic part will be forming, and then we have a part which is referred to as the phallic part. So the phallic part is, in the case of the males, is the one which will now form both the spongy urethra and the membranous part of the urethra. Now, the bladder is connected through the urachus to the umbilical area. This is remnant of the allantois to the umbilical area. So, since we are dealing with the digestive system, I just wanted you to note that that septum might not develop, and therefore the rectum will be connected to the bladder, like in the case of the male, It might be connected even to the urethra because it failed to develop. In the case of the females, the urogenital sinus, the lower part of the urogenital sinus develops into, well, the upper part develops also into the vagina. So you might have the rectum connected to the vagina through some fistula. So those fistulas are important as a result of failure of the urorectal septum to completely fuse. I wanted just to show that as we look at the digestive tract. So let's look at the congenital malformations. I said that congenital malformation is the one which is observed at birth. It's observed at birth. Anything after that that changes will not be referred to as congenital. It might be a malformation, but it will not be called a congenital malformation. So we have those malformations which are related to obstruction of the GIT. We can have atresia, where some parts of the wall, because of failure of the blood vessels to develop, the part of the wall sort of atrophies. The wall atrophies, becomes very narrow. Or stenosis. Stenosis can result because of failure of canalization. Usually the tube is full of the cells multiply until they fill the entire tube. Then these cells might not die off. The central cells might not die off to establish an epithelia, in which case we'll have now that as a narrow part of the digestive tract. That is stenosis. We have aplasia, which is failure completely to develop, failure of any part of the GIT to develop, either because there's no blood vessels to that particular area completely, so the whole wall does not establish. And then we have hypertrophy. Hypertrophy, where we're talking about hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. This one here is stenosis of the smooth muscle that forms the pyloric sphincter can overgrow, undergo hypertrophy. As a result of that, that part becomes very, very narrow. We need to distinguish this from others. So in this case, because it is within the pylorus, when the child takes milk after an hour or two, the child will have what we call projectile vomiting. So the child vomits, but that vomitus will not have any bile. We need to distinguish the two. It will not have any bile, as opposed to what we refer to as the annular pancreas, where the pancreas surrounds the duodenum, in which case the child will take milk. After some time, the child will then have that projectile vomiting, but that vomitus will have some bile. But both of them are projectile vomiting. Then we have Hirschsprung's disease. This one here usually occurs in the megacolon. It occurs in the colon. And this is failure of the neurocrine cells to migrate and establish the enteric nervous system. So when we have no enteric nervous system, then that particular part of the wall will continue to distend whenever there is some food in it. And that distension, therefore, is what is referred to as a megacolon. And that is Hirschsprung's disease. Usually, this will also be associated with other malformations in which the neurocrine cells play a role. So we need to be able to distinguish that very clearly. Those can include the heart malformations, where we have ventricular septal defects, because the neurocrine cells are very important in the septation of the heart into the various chambers. Then we have the imperforate anus I've talked about, failure of the anal membrane to disappear. A cloacal membrane usually will have been divided into the anal membrane and then the urogenital sinus membrane. So if the anal membrane fails to disappear, undergo apoptosis, and persists, then we refer to that as imperforate anus. And then usually abnormal vascular development, where you might have excessive branches or less branches within the digestive tract. So these are some of the abnormalities. We have others. Then there is a problem of communication, abnormal communications. And this we refer to as fistulas. I've already talked about tracheoesophageal fistula, where the trachea and the esophagus are connected by a hole. So whenever the child takes any food, part of that food will go to the trachea, the milk will go to the trachea, and the child will be choking. Rectovesicular fistula, this is because of failure of the rectal septum to develop. So there'll be a hole connecting the rectum and the urinary bladder. Rectovaginal, between the rectum and the vagina, is because of failure again of the rectal septum to develop. Or rectourethral fistula, because all these structures, the bladder, the vagina, the urethra, urogenital sinus, the definitive urogenital sinus of the urorectal septum. Urachal fistula is where we have the connection of the urinary bladder now all the way to the umbilical area. To the umbilical area. I said that is where you have the allantois, connection to the allantois. So that one there will be connecting to the urinary bladder, but possibly that is more reproductive, urinary than digestive. We have duplication. Cysts will be very large areas, usually can be formed, whereby we have an outpocketing of some parts of the GIT, and those outpocketings might contain some fluid. That's a cystic. Then we have the diverticular. The most common diverticulum is what we call Meckel's diverticulum. Meckel's diverticulum. And this one is a patent vitelline duct. Remember, we talked about a vitelline duct being at the axis of rotation of the midgut. So that can sometimes persist and remain as Meckel's diverticulum. Then we have, usually after return into the abdominal cavity, the midgut is fixed to the posterior abdominal. The entire gut, midgut, parts, and part of the foregut will be fixed to the posterior abdominal wall by the mesentery. So we can have errors of fixation, and because they are not fixed, then there can be twisting of the intestines very easily because they are not anchored the posterior abdominal wall. That twisting is what we call volvulus. We might also have some adhesions between some parts of the intestines because of that problems of fixation, and subhepatic cecum. Subhepatic cecum is supposed to be usually in the lower part of the right part, but if there is during the return, the cecum might be very close to the liver, very close to the liver, and not in the suprainguinal region. We have errors of rotation, and there might be no rotation of the gut. Remember, we talked about the stomach rotating through 90 degrees clockwise, We have the midgut rotating through a total of 270 degrees, comprising of an initial 90 degrees and 180 degrees. So sometimes the gut fails to rotate. Then it can be incomplete malrotation, incomplete. Instead of the 90 degrees or the 270 total degrees, it might be less than that. So some of the structures will not be in their normal locations in the adult as a result of this malrotation. Situs inversus, this is where we have reverse rotation, complete reverse rotation. And this one here is where we have, when we have this reverse rotation, then other structures will also be affected usually because they share a common gene in terms of rotation. So we might have the heart, instead of rotating to the right, rotate to the left. Then the heart will be on the right side of the thoracic cavity. Then we can have non-return. Usually we have the herniation into the umbilical region, and that failure of return will cause problems, of course. One of them is omphalocele. We refer to it as omphalocele. Omphalocele. Failure of the gut to return into the abdominal cavity. It can be failure of the total gut or part of the gut to return into the abdominal cavity. And then you can have umbilical hernia, where a small part of the digestive tract remains within the umbilical cavity. You might find some people with a dilated navel area. So the navel area is dilated. If you push a finger, you find that there is a hole. So that's what we refer to as the umbilical hernia, where the intestines get into the umbilical region. Eventration, failure of the anterior abdominal wall to completely close, sometimes because of the medial folding of the ventral part of the abdominal wall. If there's a failure, then part of the intestines will be outside. That we refer to as gastroschisis. Gastroschisis. These are some of the conditions I just want to show here. This is what we refer to as Meckel's diverticulum. Meckel's diverticulum. Here you can see some stenosis of the butt of the gut. This is failure of the complete recanalization or hypertrophy of the epithelial linings. We have a narrow gut here, which can cause obstruction. This is here. You can see a very narrow part that is called. Usually we should have the whole gut forming a single hole. Occasionally it might not. So we might have some web-like parts of the epithelia. So we have two holes formed within the gut because of incomplete recanalization in the various parts of the GIT. So any of this can happen. Now, those are malformations which can occur in the entire tract of the GIT. We'll be looking at the pancreas and look at specific malformation of the pancreas. We had looked at the general structure of the GIT, gastrointestinal tract. You remember this picture? We are going to start, we looked at the esophagus. I'll just summarize that. And we said the esophagus has a mucosa comprising of an epithelia that is stratified, squamous, non-keratinized epithelia. It has a lamina propria with loose connective muscularis mucosa. This dark area is muscularis mucosa, comprising of smooth muscles arranged in usually inner succulent layers, and then the submucosa. Up to the muscularis mucosa, that is what we refer to as the mucosa. Then we have the submucosa, and in the case of the esophagus, within the submucosa, we have the two esophageal glands, mucus glands. Through esophageal lower part close to the stomach. Close to the stomach, within the lamina propria, here, we'll be having the what you call cardiac glands, which are mucus secreting glands. It secretes mucus that is acid resistant, that can neutralize the acid to prevent acidity getting into the esophagus whenever there is acid reflux. Then we have the muscular layer, or tunica muscularis, and the muscular layer we talked about in the entire GIT, except the stomach. Except the stomach, we will be having the inner circular and outer longitudinal. Inner circular and outer longitudinal. In the case of the stomach, we have an additional oblique layer. We have an additional inner oblique layer. So that is what we need to note. Now, in the esophagus, the skeletal muscle is present in the upper third of the esophagus. So the entire upper third of the esophagus consists of skeletal muscle. And then the middle third consists of a mixture of skeletal muscle and smooth muscle, both in the longitudinal and in the circular layers. And in the lower third, we have only smooth muscle. This is to facilitate voluntary swallowing. So it assists the pharyngeal constrictors and the tongue in swallowing, the initial part of swallowing. And then I said the outer part of the esophagus can consist of either an adventitia in the areas that are not covered by peritoneum, which includes the neck region, the cervical part, and then also the thoracic part of the esophagus. Those will not be covered by peritoneum, so we have an adventitia. In all the cases, adventitia will comprise of dense connective tissue. Dense connective tissue having collagen fibers and some elastic fibers, and also some blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics, because these ones are entering into the digestive tract from the adventitia, from the outside. So that is the arrangement of the esophagus. Between the inner circular and the outer longitudinal, we normally have the enteric nervous system that we refer to as the myenteric plexus. The myenteric plexus. This will consist of cell bodies and axons which are interconnected in the entire digestive tract, forming what you call the enteric nervous system. That will also include, within the submucosa, we have the submucosal plexus. Submucosal plexus, also called Meissner's plexus. That is the structure of the esophagus. Now, at the gastroesophageal junction, sometimes it's called esophagogastric junction. At the esophagogastric junction, there's an abrupt change of epithelia from stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelia to simple columnar epithelia. Simple epithelia. These areas where we have abrupt change of epithelia usually are prone areas. Instead of producing, in this particular case, instead of producing stratified squamous, will produce simple columnar. They will then be initially programmed to produce some squamous cells. But because of acid reflux in these areas, sometimes those cells can transform based on the environment and now produce simple columnar, which is the lining of the stomach. That's what we refer to as metaplasia. These are also areas where cancer can develop.